Hi, I'm Andy, the Palm Springs linguist, and today what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to tell my story about how I learned to speak Spanish fluently. Now, the very first problematic word I've used is fluently. What does that mean? Fluency in a language is interpreted differently by different people, but I'll tell you my take on the word. As a second language learner in Spanish, English is my native language, and I did not hear Spanish at home at all. I'm never going to be at the same level as a native speaker of Spanish. That I've accepted. Not that it's not possible, but I would have to put myself in a completely different context to make that true. But I'm still fluent. And how do I know I'm fluent? Because I can navigate really any situation in Spanish and do very well. The people that I talk with will always understand me. And on the other end, I can understand the vast majority of the Spanish that I hear. Do I make mistakes? Sure, absolutely. And I always will, but fewer and fewer, and my language becomes more and more sophisticated as time goes on. So here's my story of how I went from a complete beginner in Spanish all the way to being fluent in the language. So first of all, my family. I want to discuss my family. I came from a family where my dad's side of the family was a Spanish-speaking family. Now, my dad never spoke Spanish with me, but my grandparents on my dad's side, they were fluent Spanish speakers. I had a grandmother that was born in Mexico, and then I had a grandfather that was born in Texas, but in a Spanish-speaking area where Spanish was his first language. For more information on this, I did a whole video called Am I Hispanic? Latino, where I go into the history of my family and the interesting story about my grandfather coming from a part of Texas that used to be part of Mexico. So I always grew up knowing that I came from a family that had Spanish in its background. And my grandparents spoke Spanish to each other, but when they spoke to my father, they spoke to him only in English. Now, my dad has told me that he really wishes that his parents would have spoken to him in Spanish. At the time, they were trying to help their child assimilate into the United States, but what they didn't realize was that it was not learning Spanish in the home will not take away from a child's English if they live in the United States. And there's plenty of research to back that up, but that was a long time ago, and they didn't know the research, and much of the research hadn't been done yet. So we understand why our grandparents, my grandparents did that. But my dad always feels like that was a little bit of a regret because he does understand some Spanish, but he doesn't speak it fluently like his parents did. And of course, that put him in a position where he couldn't pass that along to his child, to me. But I did have the drive to learn it on my own. So starting off in junior high school, I actually took French classes. I didn't take Spanish classes. My mom's side of the family was French speaking, and all of my other brothers and sisters had taken Spanish classes. And my mom really wanted one of her children to learn how to speak French. And that was actually her first language. So I took some French and I enjoyed it. But then by the time I got to high school, I realized that there were not many people around me that I could practice my French with. So I live in Southern California, and I was raised in Southern California, where there's lots of Spanish speakers. So I knew that if I switched to Spanish, that I would get lots of opportunity to speak Spanish. So I wanted to have a language that was higher utility for the area that I lived in. So I started working on my Spanish in high school, and I learned some Spanish in high school. And then I went on to college, and I continued some Spanish in college. And then I became my degree was in linguistics. So when I was getting my linguistics degree, since I wanted to also improve my Spanish, not only did I continue to take classes in Spanish, but some of the papers that I had to write, I would write about the Spanish language for my linguistics classes. So one example is I did a paper about Arabic loanwords in Spanish. So here's an example of that, albondigas. So, many of you that are familiar with Mexican food, albondigas is a type of soup. It's meatball soup. And that was a word that was very familiar to me as a kid because I grew up with a lot of Mexican food. And I remember being a kid once, even though I was an English only kid at the time, I was in a restaurant and I remember looking at the menu and it said meatball soup. And I was a little confused by that. Like, well, what is meatball soup? I'd never heard of that before. So when I talked to the waitress had mentioned the word albondigas, and I'm like, oh, it's albondigas soup. I had prior knowledge of that because of the food that was around me. Well, albondigas is an excellent example of a word that starts with the letters A and L, words like algebra in English. That word originates from Arabic. Well, there are lots and lots of words in Spanish that originate from Arabic, albondigas being one example of that. So I did some papers about the Spanish language and started to learn more and more. And then I decided to become a teacher. So when I became a teacher, I worked on a teaching credential where I could teach in Spanish because I really wanted to be able to use my Spanish in my daily life. So I got a bilingual certificate as well as my teaching credential, and I started teaching in Spanish to elementary school kids, in English and in Spanish, of course. And that was a fantastic situation because I got to use it for a good part of the day, and I got to interact with native speakers, not just the kids, but their parents. And my Spanish really took off at that point. I became far more fluent than I was before, really expanded my vocabulary. And because I had a degree in linguistics, I was really fascinated by language and grammar and syntax and morphology and all the things that come with linguistics. So I did all sorts of reading about the Spanish language, and I was really fascinated about the structures behind the Spanish language. So I really got into that and really found that really quite fascinating. But of course, the mainstay of learning a language is input, preferably comprehensible input, input where you're understanding the majority of what's being said, enough that you can use the context to try to figure out the words that you don't understand. So I tried to read as many books as I could in Spanish, simple books, that were at my level. I would watch television shows in Spanish. I remember I really enjoyed the show Sabido Gigante, which was a lot of fun, and that was very visual. So there was a lot of antics on that TV show where you could see things visually, what they were talking about. So it was pretty easy to understand. I would try to listen to as much music in Spanish as I could. I remember that Gloria Estefan was a real favorite of mine. She really enunciated very clearly, where even though Spanish was my second language and often listening to music was difficult to understand, I could always make out what she said. So I really enjoyed that music, and I tried to listen to it as much as I could and other Spanish speaking music. Well, another place where I practiced a lot is that I was a Disney cast member. I worked at Disneyland. I worked mostly on the attractions at Disneyland. Pirates of the Caribbean, Haunted Mansion. I was on the opening crew of Splash Mountain. I worked on Space Mountain, Star Tours, Submarine Voyage, many others. And of course, there's guests from all over the world, as well as many local guests who speak Spanish. So whenever I would interact with the guests, if I saw that they spoke Spanish or I could hear they would speak Spanish, I would speak Spanish with them, with anybody that would give me the opportunity. I also practiced my French that way as well. So that was another way that I would try to practice and use my Spanish. Um, and by the way, Disneyland is also one of my great interests. And on this channel, Palm Springs Linguist channel, I have many videos about Disneyland history if you're interested in that. So another way that I practiced my Spanish, even though I didn't have a lot of people around me other than at work. At work, I had lots of people that around me that spoke Spanish. But at home and in my circle of friends, I didn't have a lot of people that spoke Spanish. But you know who does speak Spanish? The dog. All dogs speak Spanish. That's a discovery I had. All dogs speak Spanish. They speak any language that you want to speak to them. They respond just as well. So I had a couple of basset hounds, and I would always speak to them exclusively in Spanish. And it actually helped build up my fluency because you're talking to the dog every day, at least a little bit. So, any chance I got, little by little, it all started to help. So another example is I would look for people that I could speak Spanish with. I remember that when I would get my hair cut, that there was one hairstylist, one barber that spoke Spanish. So I would request that person to cut my hair. And once I got into the barber chair, we would start talking, and I would ask them if they spoke Spanish, and I would start speaking Spanish with them. So just literally looking for any chance to practice. So another example is when I would go to a party. If I would go to a party, the first thing I would do is I would look around the room and I would see, okay, is there anybody here that I know speaks Spanish? If so, I would try to sit next to them. And then if they were patient enough with me, I would try to speak in Spanish with them. And then, preferably for the rest of the evening if possible. So always looking for those opportunities. And another place that I really got a lot of practice with was I was fortunate enough to be a teacher. I said before I was a bilingual teacher. And even after I stopped being a bilingual teacher and I started teaching just in English, the parents, the majority of the parents in the neighborhood that I was teaching in, their first language was Spanish. So I would practice speaking Spanish with them virtually every day. So that gave me a lot of practice as well. So, and then I became a vice principal. And when I became a vice principal, I was a little scared that I wouldn't be able to speak in Spanish as much. And I was completely wrong. I actually got to speak more Spanish as a vice principal than I did as a teacher because I was interacting with parents even more. Teachers get to interact with parents before school or after school when they drop off the kids or the kids get, picked up by their parents, or maybe you would do a telephone call. But as a vice principal, you got to speak with parents throughout the day. So I always spoke in Spanish with them when, that was their preferred language. And I was fortunate enough for my school to be in a neighborhood where a lot of people spoke Spanish. So that was really a blessing. Now, after that, I got out of other jobs where I didn't have as much opportunity to speak Spanish. And so there was a little bit of a lag for a few years where I didn't do as good of a job of keeping up with my Spanish. And I did lose some fluency. But in recent years, I've really rekindled my interest in Spanish. And some of the same strategies, I'm looking for opportunities to speak with different people. So I've been working out with a trainer. Well, fortunately, this trainer in the gym is a native Spanish speaker. So he started to speak just in Spanish with me. And that has been so valuable because, with a trainer, you end up talking about all sorts of things, about your life and their lives and what's going on in the world. And by doing all that in Spanish, it's really helped me grow my vocabulary. So right now, we are in a golden age of language learning. I've heard different YouTubers say that, different polyglots say that. Steve Kaufman, for example, has said that. And I really think he's right. It's a golden age. Why is it a golden age? We have so many opportunities because of technology to connect with people who speak our target language. So now I've made an effort to, whenever I'm in the car, I'll turn on a podcast in Spanish or in French. I'm also working on French. Another example is I watch some YouTube videos in Spanish. I'm even, of course, you know, now I'm at a level where I'm not just listening to things that teach me Spanish, I'm listening to things that I'm interested in that just happens to be in Spanish. Um, and you know, that's a strategy you should try to use as soon as you possibly can, as soon as you find it that you understand it well enough to enjoy it. Because if you enjoy it, you'll continue to do it. So, you know, now after all these years, what I've really realized that I didn't realize when I first started to learn Spanish was that if you're going to learn another language, a second language, to really become fluent, you need to make it part of your daily life. And I was fortunate enough to have had experiences such as teaching and being a vice principal and things like that, working at Disneyland, where it was part of my daily life. But now that I'm not doing any of those things, I need to look and find ways to incorporate it into my daily life. And technology's made that a lot easier. You can reach out to people to speak with over the internet. But also getting over being shy about speaking a language. That's something I've done a lot better at lately, is that if I'm in a restaurant, let's say I'm standing in line for some food, and I hear that the person in front of me is speaking Spanish with the cashier, well, then when it's my turn, I start speaking immediately in Spanish because I know that person is bilingual. And so all those little opportunities really add up. So it's still a journey. Is my Spanish perfect? No, but I'm so much better than I used to be. And I definitely feel that I'm fluent in the language because I can navigate just about any situation and stay in Spanish. Um, Learning a language, you know, there's a lot of times where I kind of feel like an imposter because there's always going to be people like native speakers, for example, who are going to speak the language better than you do. And that's certainly the case for me. But I have to remind myself that I can navigate these situations in Spanish. I have a teacher credential that tells me that I speak Spanish well enough to teach kids. I have to remind myself and give myself credit for the Spanish that I've learned. So as I go out and try to learn other languages, I have to remind myself of that. I have to remind myself to not be shy and take every opportunity I can to practice the language. When you practice the language, you put yourself in a situation where you're vulnerable, and you have to accept and embrace that vulnerability because you are going to make mistakes and you're not going to sound as sophisticated as you do with your native language. And that's okay. That's absolutely okay. Enjoy the journey. So this is how I learned Spanish. What languages have you learned? Please let me know in the comments and let me know your story. How did you learn your languages? Or if you have any questions for me, please tell me in the comments. And let me leave you with this. One of the videos that I've made on my channel, of course, I make videos about language and linguistics and other topics that I'm interested in, like Disney, for example. But most of them are about language and linguistics. So I cover videos about different languages and different topics, but I have a language about the Spanish, I have a video, excuse me, about the Spanish language, about the word for lime and the word for lemon. And it's really an interesting one because it's not consistent across dialects. In fact, some of them contradict each other. So I will leave you with the link. I'll put it in the description down below. And thank you so much for joining me on this video. And I'll see you in the next one. Adios.